Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the Festival Director. FODI is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival based in Sydney, Australia, that aims to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. FODI gathers the world's best experts, innovative thinkers and mischief makers to provoke and inspire curious minds. For some, the image of Israel is a shining example of liberal democratic ideals. And this ideal may have been broken by the Netanyahu Government's action in Gaza since 7th of October 2023. Yet for others, the positive image projected by Israel has always been a convenient myth, allowing dominant powers within the international community to turn a blind eye to decades of Palestinian suffering. Academic Saree Makdisi argues that we are living in a culture of denial. He says much of the West is complicit through the act of self-deception. In his 2024 talk, Tolerance is a Wasteland, Makdisi offers a possible outcome for both Palestinians and Israelis.
Thank you, Maher. Thank you, all of you, for coming. And I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation whose land we're standing on. I'd also like to thank all of the organizers at FODI whose incredible work have made this amazing set of events possible. My talk today is about denial, but I must begin with an assertion of what it is that is being denied. For the past 322 days, the Israeli army has repeatedly ordered sleepless, hungry, traumatized, shelterless, and comfortless men, women, and children in Gaza to gather what remains of their meager belongings and to flee for their lives. Tens of thousands at a time, they are driven from one shattered and ruined neighborhood to another as Israel pulverizes their homes, schools, hospitals, markets, farms, and universities into dust. All of the vestiges and routines of these people's everyday lives, going to work, going to school, making coffee, preparing meals, visiting relatives, have been obliterated all around them, often in the blink of an eye. The terrifying orders to flee come by day and by night, but nowhere in Gaza is safe from Israeli bombs and shells, packed with high explosives, white phosphorus, balls of tungsten, flechette darts carefully designed with the solitary purpose of shredding human flesh, raining down on Gaza's families. 90% of Gaza's surface area has been subject to Israel's sudden evacuation orders, the UN tells us, and 90% of the population has been displaced, often repeatedly. Civilians, said Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, are being pushed into ever deeper circles of hell. He added, they keep being forced to move like human pinballs across a landscape of destruction and death. And Mawasi in central Gaza is now so packed because of Israel's evacuation orders, so packed with refugees that it contains 34,000 people per square kilometer. If Greater Sydney had that same population density, there would be 400 million people here. In any case, flight by now no longer has a purpose for Gaza's exhausted families, many of whom have simply given up in despair and consigned themselves to their fates. The Israelis bombed them in their homes and in the homes of their friends and relatives. Then, one by one, in the clinics and hospitals to which they had resorted in the vain expectation that surely no one would actually bomb a hospital. Then in the schools that, emblazoned with the United Nations blue, had also been converted to emergency shelters for thousands of people, only to be bombed in turn. At last, all that remained for the Israelis to bomb were a desperate people's shelter of last resort, makeshift tents of fabric and plastic, dripping with rainwater in the wet season and roasting like ovens in the dry. And then those were bombed too. Flight in Gaza might as well simply be reserved not for people, but for the other meaning of that word, for bombs, rockets, and shells, the American-made warplanes and helicopter gunships, the carefully, thoughtfully, proudly, combat-proven, made-in-Israel dystopian sniper drones that, as doctors and journalists have been documenting for months, routinely hunt down individuals, including individual children, to put bullets in their brains by remote control. I saw, said one Canadian doctor, even small children with direct sniper shots to the head as well as the chest. They were not combatants, she added. They were small children. For the lucky dead, there are burial shrouds and a few minutes of hasty prayer under the buzz of Israeli drones before burial in communal pits excavated by bulldozers and backhoes. The corpses of those less fortunate rot and bloat in the ruined streets in the winter mud or the summer heat and are picked at by stray dogs. For those not killed outright, there is, at best, the horror of rudimentary medical treatment and amputations of limbs without anesthetic and by the light of mobile phones in the shattered ruins of what had once been modern hospitals. Worse yet is the dreaded possibility of a slow, lingering, painful, and suffocating death buried alone under tons of flattened concrete and steel that had once been family homes and apartment buildings, the calls to supper and the laughter of children replaced by the calls of distant rescuers trying in vain to shift tons of concrete with their bare hands. And then there are the bodies simply blown apart or vaporized by the sheer explosive power of Israel's 2,000-pound bombs, or shredded into so much formerly human protoplasm that it needs to be scooped up by any survivors, including children, and collected in plastic bags. 2 weeks ago, the detonations of the specially designed narrow bombs, carefully guided by Israeli pilots into a United Nations school sheltering thousands of people, left no intact bodies at all, only unrecognizable lumps of flesh in singed clothing. People coming to collect their dead family members for burial after that bombing were simply given plastic bags containing charred and bloody flesh corresponding to the approximate weight of their children or spouses. 20 kilos for a child, 50 kilos for a woman, 70 kilos for a man. Does this bag contain the remains of my child? One father asked. Treat it like your child, he was told, and bury it as you would have buried your child. Surely the most painful scenes coming out of Gaza are the daily images of parents having one last embrace with their children, and young children in turn mourning their murdered parents. On a daily basis, the Israeli government updates the list of terrorist facilities, terrorist infrastructure, terrorist positions, terrorist cells, terrorists, etc., that it claims to have eliminated. It acknowledges, of course, the occasional mistake and routinely finds itself innocent after what it assures us was a thorough investigation, only to repeat the same mistake over and over and over again. Whom the Israelis kill in any given instance is entirely random. Entire families have been wiped from the civil registry, and thousands of children have become sole survivors of families that no longer exist. The destruction has been so severe and so extensive that it's absurd to talk about mistakes, or Israel's fancy AI targeting algorithms, its risible rules of engagement, its attacks on specific sites. It's easier to talk about the few places left in Gaza, the white dots on that map, that Israel hasn't yet destroyed, than to tabulate the areas that it has. The early points of comparison to other bombing campaigns in history kept surpassing one another to the point where the horrifying statistics lost traction and started to lose all meaning. Within weeks, the Israelis had dropped more bombs on Gaza than the US had dropped on Iraq and Afghanistan in 20 years of war. Within months, they had wrought more destruction in Gaza than Second World War bombing had produced in London, Hamburg, and Dresden combined. In less than a year, Israel has dropped 80,000 tons of explosives on Gaza, the equivalent of more than 4 15-kiloton Hiroshima bombs. Try to imagine 4 atomic bombs being dropped here in Sydney. Then recall that the area of Greater Sydney is over 12,000 square kilometers. The area of Gaza is 365. Israel's bombing has produced, according to the UN, 40 million tons of rubble, the equivalent of a line of dump trucks stretching over land and sea from New York to Singapore. The rubble alone will take 15 years to remove. Save the Children reported in the first 3 weeks of the war that Israel had killed more children by that point, just in the first 3 weeks, than were killed annually in all conflict zones across the entire world since 2019. And countless identical weeks have followed. Israel has by now killed so many children in Gaza, it's even been killing babies who were born since October, their entire brief time on earth encompassed by a torrent of death and destruction. The official death toll is over 40,000, but that's a severe undercount because it includes only bodies that can be positively identified against the civil register, not bodies that have been shredded or bodies that have been vaporized or bodies that are still lying entombed under all that rubble. Not the cancer and dialysis patients, the premature babies, the new mothers with postpartum complications, the victims of ordinary heart attacks, strokes, and preventable diseases, those already dying of malnourishment, and those gravely injured, most of whom are condemned to death due to Israel's methodical destruction of the medical infrastructure in Gaza. Taking all these factors into account, the British medical journal The Lancet estimates the true death toll so far at almost 190,000 people, half of them children. That's 10% of Gaza's population, and a year on, the end is nowhere in sight. Beyond the tens of thousands of civilians killed, entire urban districts have been wiped from the surface of the earth, and the largest Palestinian city in history has been leveled to the ground. Gaza's basic infrastructure of electricity, water, and sewage networks, repeatedly battered in previous Israeli incursions, has now been destroyed altogether, often by careful and deliberate demolition, not just of water installations, but of schools, homes, and universities, the videos of which, as you can see, Israeli soldiers gleefully post to their Instagram channels. Indeed, most of the schools and all of the universities in Gaza have been destroyed, often by demolition charges. Israel has targeted and destroyed the bakeries producing the staple on which the population depends for its survival. It has bombed the fishermen's boats, which are or were another potential source of nourishment. It has bombed and churned up the fields and greenhouses that once sustained Gaza's ability to feed itself. It has bombed water conduits and reservoirs. People are forced to drink dirty, polluted, contaminated, or brackish water with the inevitable results of diarrhea and disease. The Israeli general Giora Eiland said last fall, and I quote him, "The international community warns us of a humanitarian disaster in Gaza and of severe epidemics. We must not shy away from this. After all, severe epidemics in the south of Gaza will bring victory closer." The first polio cases, as you may have seen, have already been reported in Gaza, leaving at least one baby already paralyzed, translating Eiland's eager prognostications into reality. Whoever survives the bombing today will be drinking seawater and eating unbaked wheat in the future, if not starving outright or dying of the diseases already proliferating. And there will be nowhere for them to live, no hospitals to sustain their lives, no schools to educate them. An entire generation of children, school children, and university students have already lost a year of school and have been subjected to trauma far beyond that which broke the minds of soldiers like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon in the trenches of the First World War. Every last detail of this catalog of horrors is the result of careful and meticulously premeditated Israeli planning by the likes of Eiland and others, and made possible by the unthinking and unblinking support of Western governments which we voted for. Taken together, all of this is further evidence, if anyone needed it, that what we're witnessing is not self-defense, it's not a war, the word used mendaciously and misleadingly by most of the mainstream Western press, least of all a war on Hamas. It's a campaign of genocidal violence against the entire population of Gaza. Indeed, it's a textbook case of genocide, as Craig Mukhiber put it in his letter resigning from his role as director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights last fall. Genocide is, after all, the term international law provides for a situation in which one group of people imposes on another, quote, conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, in addition to killing or causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group. Mukhiber's words have been echoed by many scholars of genocide and the Holocaust since then, all the way to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which, finding the claim of genocide plausible at least, has repeatedly ordered Israel to suspend its actions to no avail. And our Western governments keep on rushing financial support and more bombs, more ammunition, more jet fuel to Israel, making themselves, and then of course us, accomplices to all of its grotesque violations of international humanitarian law. They seem to have no qualms about what it is they're supporting. All of this carnage, we are told in sanctimonious terms from across the Western political class, is not genocide. It is merely Israel's right to self-defense. There is no understanding of the concept of self-defense, however, that includes bombing children in tents or withholding food, water, and medicine from a population for whose welfare one is legally responsible, which Israel is as the occupying power in Gaza, a point reiterated in countless UN Security Council resolutions and in a recent World Court ruling. As Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Palestine, has repeatedly pointed out, a state cannot legally claim the right of self-defense from territory on which it has chosen to impose a belligerent military occupation. Israeli politicians, in any case, have been using an altogether different language than that of self-defense to describe their actions. The Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, put it with his uncharacteristic crudeness as early as October 9 when he said, and I quote him, "We are imposing a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we will act accordingly." Giora Island, whom I quoted earlier, wishing for epidemics to speed up victory, says in cold newspaper print that Israel's target isn't just the fighters of Hamas, but, and I quote, the entire Gaza population, unquote. The Israeli president said the same thing. There are no innocents in Gaza. If this leaves any room for doubt as to Israel's intent, usually the hardest part of a claim of genocide to prove, and yet in this instance proved beyond doubt, including by South Africa's legal team at the January genocide hearings in the World Court, it is allayed by Netanyahu's repeated reminders to the Israeli public and to his army that, quote, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you," says our Holy Bible. His biblical reference was unmistakable. It's to a passage in the Bible with a commandment from God that reads, and I quote, "Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and donkey," unquote. And that is exactly what the Israeli army is doing right now. I wanted to rehearse this litany of horrors because all around us in the Western world, from Paris and London to New York to LA to Sydney and Canberra, we continue to hear some people denying that there's a genocide at all, and even complaining at the constant plaintive reminders that all of us in the West are complicit in it because our governments make it possible. How, we must wonder, or at least I wonder, how can anyone sustain such a level of denial in the face of the first genocide in human history to be live-streamed by its victims and available for any of us to witness in real time on a phone held in the palm of our hand? Such people, desperately moved by the images of suffering, of Israeli suffering on the 7th of October, have had nothing to say about Palestinian suffering on a far greater scale and for all the months ever since, to which they simply turn a blind eye. For them, in fact, the problem is the protest against the genocide rather than the genocide itself. How can anyone be so narcissistically heartless? And I'm not talking here about overt racists who explicitly call for the destruction of Gaza. I'm talking about ordinary, normal people, most of them solid progressives when it comes to politics, advocates of gender and racial equality, anxious about climate change, concerned for the homeless, voters for the most progressive of politicians. What we're seeing here is not heartlessness. These people clearly have plenty of heart. It is rather one manifestation of a much broader culture of denial. The reason people like this seem not to see or to recognize Palestinian suffering is that they really do not see or recognize it. They are far too intent, far too focused on the suffering of people with whom they can much more readily identify, people that they understand to be just like themselves. A scene of suffering that, with all the logic of a monopoly, occludes overshadows, displaces, removes from sight, hides from view, any other kind of suffering with which it might otherwise seem to compete. And if anyone brings that occluded suffering to view, their reaction will be one of anger. Why, they will say, why are you telling me to look at that? Why don't you join me in my outrage about this? Can you not see this? Don't look over there, look over here with me. Such forms of occlusion and denial are features of a much more widespread culture of denial that for decades enabled otherwise progressive and left-wing people in the West to support the Zionist project in Palestine, while remaining in denial about what it is they're actually supporting. How, after all, I've often asked myself, can a left-leaning Western person reconcile a commitment to democracy and civil rights with support for a state that practices apartheid? How can one balance one's support for the separation of church and state, one of the core Western values, with one's support for a state in which the lack of such a distinction is a founding premise? One's belief in civil marriage and women's rights with a state that has no institution of civil marriage and imposes ancient theocratic restrictions on the rights of married women. One's affirmation of a culture of inclusion with a political system premised on brute exclusion. These contradictions, I think, are not mere hypocrisy, any more than the people who mourn the loss of Israeli life but turn a blind eye to the loss of Palestinian life are being hypocritical. Hypocrisy involves a kind of self-knowledge. And what we're talking about here is denial, not awareness. Two forms of denial need to be taken into account. The first is pretty basic: refusing facts, refusing narratives, etc. There were no Palestinians, ethnic cleansing didn't happen, there was no Nakba, or today there are no war crimes, it's not a genocide, etc., etc. These things are all pre-enabled, they're facilitated by the pre-scripted and pre-digested discourses of terrorism, extremism, the Hamas Charter, Islamist militants, etc., endlessly recycled by our media into a mash of misinformation and disinformation, often resting on distortions at the level of grammar, syntax, word choice, and sentence construction that some people continue to absorb, I don't know how, without questioning it. In any case, ignoring, looking aside, refusing to recognize, these are difficult to sustain on their own, especially in the face of a massive archive of documentary evidence to the contrary. And they provide no basis for the elaboration of a progressive sense of self. Something more is needed to enable such a subject to reconcile her support for Zionism with her support to progressive values. Essential to this miraculous act of political alchemy, as I argue in my book, Tolerance is a Wasteland, is a very specific form of denial, in which the Palestinian claim to Palestine is not simply refused, covered up, or negated. Rather, it is occluded by being expressed through an affirmation of various positive virtues that can fervently be embraced. The emphasis of the positive value doesn't just make it possible to overlook the dark history occluded by the act of joyous affirmation, it makes the dark history possible in the first place. It nourishes and sustains it over the years. What's needed then is not just denial in the negative sense, but a set of values to affirm in a positive sense, or better yet, a set of values to affirm the very affirmation of which transact denial in such a way that the act of denial is simply invisible to the person engaging in it. Let me offer some examples to ground this discussion and make it a bit less abstract. After the Zionist gangs and militias that would eventually coalesce into the Israeli army had completed their expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from Palestine during the Nakba of 1948, the terrain left behind was a landscape of empty ruins. The first step in remaking this landscape in the image of the new Jewish state was the demolition of Palestinian homes, mosques, churches, and cemeteries, as well as the methodical extirpation of the cultivated landscape of citrus and olive groves and prickly pear cactuses, the indigenous landscape to which those homes and other spaces had once corresponded. No sooner had Palestinian villages been demolished than the agencies and auxiliaries of the new state, in particular the Jewish National Fund, started planting forests over their ruins. Unlike the demolition of family homes, which was done as quietly as possible, the project of tree planting over the ruins of these now unmentioned, disappeared, erased from all maps villages was, and still is, carried out with much fanfare and under the banner of grand proclamations. People, particularly Jewish people, but not only Jewish people, as I'm sure many among you will recall, are invited to plant a tree in Israel, to donate funds for afforestation, to make the desert bloom, and to visit ceremonial tree planting sites where they can actively participate in this quite literally wonderful endeavor. As though by magic, then, a project of ethnic cleansing has been transformed into one of family-centered tree planting, and by virtue of that transformation, it has secured the support that it needs from progressive people who would never knowingly lend their support to a process of mass eviction and home demolition, but do lend their support as long as it is disavowed and almost literally unknown, turned into something else, something positive and affirmative, such as greening the landscape, making the desert bloom, and so on. The deliberate and systematically worked through occlusion of the Palestinian claim to the land has thus itself been occluded, been covered up, been denied, by a transformative act of affirmation to which hyperbolic levels of acclaim and attention can be drawn. Don't look over there at the Palestinian villages. Look over here at the wonderful forests that make the desert bloom. We could tell a similar story with regard to those, I think, by now dwindling numbers of progressive or left-wing supporters of Israel in the West who think of it as a democratic state. Or, for instance, those progressives, I was interviewed by one of them on ABC radio recently, who think of Netanyahu as a threat to the soul of an otherwise intact Israeli democracy. They find it impossible to accept the idea that Israel was never a democracy, certainly not to the millions of non-Jews over whom it has ruled for most of its existence as a state, and also not to the second-class Palestinian citizens of the state, who, from the moment of the state's inception, have been denied rights and privileges enjoyed, and this is very important. Palestinian citizens of the state are denied rights and privileges enjoyed not just by Jewish Israeli citizens, but also by non-Israeli Jews, simply on the basis of their Jewishness, access to land above all. Instead of flatly denying that Israel is an apartheid state, which it is, according to a whole series of authoritative reports published by a UN agency, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and also reflected in an advisory opinion by the World Court recently, people transact this form of denial precisely by asserting Israel's status as a democracy, a Jewish democracy. Thus, Israel's status as an apartheid state is denied not simply by saying, no, it's not, but by fervently insisting on its status as a Jewish and democratic state, which is, of course, a contradiction in terms. The assertion of democracy is itself the denial of apartheid, stated positively rather than negatively. Once again, don't look over there at the apartheid, look over here at the Jewish democracy. Or rather, look over here in order not to see what's happening over there in the occluded background. Perhaps the most extraordinary example of this kind of denial by affirmation can be seen in the moment from which my book derives its title. In 2004, the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles, an institution deeply involved in the transformative repackaging for an American audience of Zionist settler colonialism as a humanitarian endeavor, a natural response to the calamity of the Holocaust, announced that it was planning to open a branch in Jerusalem. The museum hired the noted LA-based architect Frank Gehry to design its Jerusalem building. He later, I'm happy to say, withdrew after a debate with me in print. And it developed, although they've had other architects since then. But anyway, they built the building. They developed interior designs for the display spaces, which, despite the name of the museum, actually were to have nothing to do with tolerance, as we understand that in the English language, but rather with the history of Zionism. The edifice, in other words, was actually a museum of Zionism repackaged as a museum of tolerance. It turned out, however, that the museum was being built on the site of the largest and most important Muslim cemetery in all of Palestine. In active use until the middle of the 20th century, though like those Palestinian villages I mentioned earlier, it was also planted over by trees by Israel, planted over with trees by Israel after 1948, in an attempt to hide the graves from view. They were building a museum of tolerance on somebody else's graveyard from which they were removing human remains, disinterring them, and unceremoniously discarding them in unmarked cardboard boxes. And yet, the project's directors in Los Angeles, importantly, heavily connected to progressive human rights activists in LA and to Hollywood in particular, notably George Clooney among others, simply could not see what was wrong with this endeavor. This sordid episode offers, to my mind, an encapsulated version of the overall argument of my book. In this case, the Palestinian claim to a cemetery space is being denied. That denial is occluded first by the attempt to literally cover it up, and then by other layers of denial, but mostly by the hyperbolic and theatricalized investment in a discourse of tolerance. For Zionism, we are told, is a mission of tolerance. To question or to oppose Zionism is therefore to engage in, you tell me, what's the opposite of tolerance? Intolerance. This militarized deployment of a discourse of tolerance, which is entirely related to the current campaign to redefine the very concept of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel and of Zionism, this expresses a broader set of patterns of affirming positive values as a means of occluding not only the denial of the Palestinian claim to Palestine, but the occlusion of that occlusion, making it all go away. Really, however, what I trace in my book is, in effect, an archaeology of an emotional and political formation that has been rapidly disappearing before our eyes. What I set out to explore is the contradiction between Israel as a racial, colonial, and apartheid state on the one hand, and Israel on the other hand, as an object of affection for the European and Western left in general, from at least the 1960s onwards. For several reasons, that contradiction is beginning to resolve itself. On an international level, the Palestinian struggle is increasingly closely identified with movements for rights and equality by other marginalized and dispossessed people, such as indigenous struggles here in Australia or Black Lives Matter in the US. Israel has, at the same time, seen the base of its own global support shift over recent years from left to right, nowhere more clearly than in the US. In response to this shift, the Zionist state itself has also been unpeeling one layer after another of the forms of denial and equivocation that formerly gave it cover among its left-leaning supporters overseas, thereby enabling and sustaining that support in the first place. In 2018, for example, the Israeli parliament passed the Jewish nation-state law, which made explicit certain formerly implicit forms of discrimination against non-Jewish citizens of the state. In material terms, the law didn't change very much. It simply affirmed what was there all along. The bet that the Israeli state has made is that it can do away with all of the trappings of progressivism and just come out as the violent racial enterprise it was all along, making up for its loss of support on the left with a gain of support among those in the West committed to building walls, deporting immigrants, breaking up families, violently policing minority communities, and crushing dissent, in other words, the right. In committing itself to this new nakedly racist agenda of violence, religious and cultural antagonism, suppression of rights, and so forth, the Israeli state has abandoned, or is gradually abandoning, all those forms of denial and occlusion that sustained the Zionist project in the West for decades among liberals and progressives. In the eyes of more and more people across the Western world, then, Israel's sociopathic and genocidal assault on Gaza was merely the final irrefutable confirmation that this is not a normal state. For the Israeli assault on Gaza is exceptional in all kinds of ways, but it also represents, in a sense, merely the continuation of a regime of dispossession that had already endured for decades. This genocide did not begin in October 2023. It began in early 1948, and it's continued ever since, mostly, to be sure, in slow motion and on a small scale. A project of ethnic cleansing and home demolition, confiscation and expulsion, execution and torture, taking place in the slow time of everyday life, and therefore generally not filtering through to distracted Western consciousness. What we've been seeing over the last 10 months represents a quantitative rather than a qualitative shift, a vast amplification and acceleration of practices that were there all along, but have now transcended the boundaries of quotidian banality and are therefore more visible as a result. The video catalog of death and destruction streamed to us in real time, the dismembered children and beheadless babies, the putrefying bodies, the shattered hospitals, all the rest of it. The videos, for example, that I'm sure you've seen of Israeli soldiers sending Palestinian civilian human shields into buildings possibly rigged with booby traps. Why did they send them in? Because too many Israeli army dogs have been killed by booby traps. They sent in Palestinian civilians. All these things, we're witnessing them all in real time, as well as the endless videos of Israeli soldiers wallowing in the destruction that they've wrought. We see all these things. Everybody has access to them. As a result, for all the harm that the Israelis have been inflicting on the Palestinians of Gaza, not to mention the West Bank and East Jerusalem for the past 10 months, they've also done irreparable harm to the image and legitimacy of their own state project, which has been revealed to anyone in the world who's able to see it, with all of its raw and unmediated horror, which surely, no mechanism of denial and occlusion can cover up. More and more people across the Western world now realize what it was that they've been supporting all along, which is why university students who represent the conscience not merely of their generation but of the world have been protesting in their hundreds of thousands on campuses from London to New York, Washington to Berkeley, LA to Sydney and Melbourne. The vast augmentation in mechanisms of surveillance, intimidation, censorship, coercion, cancellation, and just brutal repression that we've all experienced over the past year may seem like evidence of the strength of the Zionist lobbying organizations patrolling the corridors of power in the Western world. But the point is that this level of censorship and repression simply was not necessary in an age when Israel's narrative of progressive innocence held sway. It's only needed now because that narrative has been lost. What looks like the strength of Zionism in the West, in other words, is actually the surest sign of its terminal weakness. The culture of denial has come to an end. Or has it? Remarkably, as I suggested earlier, there still are some people among us who continue to indulge in denial about what's happening in Gaza. The litany of horror with which I began my talk today remains obscure, if not entirely invisible to them. In fact, their focus is elsewhere. How can that be? No matter what term you want to use to describe it, how can anyone at least not recognize, if not be outraged by, what's happening in the full view of the world? It's not just Gaza, by the way. Thousands of Palestinian prisoners are being held by the Israelis without charge in unspeakable conditions, in foul dungeons, where they're subjected to execution, torture, and rape. When a state prosecutor in Israel made the slightest gesture of holding some of those accused of rape accountable, the Israeli army bases were overrun by rioters who succeeded in freeing them, and the Israeli parliament held a public debate on live television as to whether rape is a legitimate tool, and concluded that it is. How can anyone still not see this state for what it is? What we're witnessing in this case, because there are people who still just don't see it, what we're witnessing in this case is a return to the mechanisms of denial and occlusion that I was discussing earlier, only this time turned on their head. Instead of transacting denial by loudly drawing attention to a positive value, this time denial is being transacted by loudly drawing attention to a negative. The structure remains intact, it's just flipped around. Still, do not look over there, join me in looking over here instead. The main way this structure of denial works today is by the constant return to and recycling of a certain narrative of what happened on October 7th. In fact, this is the entire purpose of the constant return to and recycling of this narrative of October 7th that continues to saturate the news space all around us in the form of a restatement. Like literally it's the same phrase over and over and over again in any article that somehow connected in any way to Gaza. And the narrative is this violence began out of the clear blue sky when one day Hamas attacked Israel on October 7, 2023 and killed 1,200 civilians. It's this restatement that allows what's happening to keep happening. This is not to say, and I want to be clear about this is not to say that terrible violence against Israeli civilians wasn't committed that day. It was. I know how words can be lifted and taken out of context, so I want to make sure that you're hearing me say that very clearly. I'm not denying the trauma of October 7th. I'm not saying that terrible things didn't happen that day. But what I am saying is that the constant return to that one day, framed in a very particular kind of way, serves to pull us away from the 322 days that have followed since then. In fact, the constant return to that one day has enabled the 322 days that have followed and to continue into the future for as far as anyone can see. For the version of October 7th to which our attention and sympathy are constantly being drawn has been frozen in time. It's been frozen in the sense that it's premised on a forestalling, a denial of all of the specific knowledge of that day that has emerged in the months since it took place, to which the Western mainstream media have been entirely impermeable, even though this information is circulating all over the mainstream press in Israel itself, in English as well as in Hebrew. This yields a far more complicated set of scenarios than the simplistic narrative of out-of-the-blue Palestinian savagery unleashed against Israel's bridal innocence, to which our attention is unceasingly drawn. We now know, for instance, that an as yet undetermined number, but clearly a significant proportion of the civilians killed that day, were in fact killed by the Israeli army by using its primary tactic, the indiscriminate bombardment of built-up areas. We now know, because the broadcast of them saying so, in their own words, appeared within weeks of October 7th, that Israeli helicopter gunship pilots and tank crews fired missiles and high-explosive shells at buildings inside Israel and at anything moving to or from Gaza without positive identification. In other words, without knowing what it was they were shooting at. Anyone with even a passing knowledge of recent military history would have recognized right away that those rows and rows and rows of burnt-out cars with their roofs torn open and with carbonized blackened skeletons inside that we kept being told were the work of Hamas fighters were, in fact, for anybody who knows warfare knows this, the unmistakable telltale signature of Hellfire missiles fired indiscriminately by Apache helicopter gunships, which Palestinians do not possess. It beggars belief. The point is, again, not to say that October 7th didn't happen, but why are all of these very, very important details, they have no presence in the Western press at all. They're all over, as you can see from these clips I'm showing you, they're all over the Israeli media, in English as well as in Hebrew. They just don't make it at all into the Western press, which just, it's like it's stuck. It's like a stuck record saying the same exact line over and over. Like, it's the stuckedness. That's what I'm interested in, not the actual details themselves are actually less important. It's the fact that this narrative is stuck. Moreover, this version of October 7th is also stuck in the sense that it's been lifted altogether out of history, as though nothing had happened before it to make it possible, as though 75 years of abrogated rights, the detention of tens of thousands of men, women, and children, the closures and lockdowns, the checkpoints and home raids, the ethnic cleansing, home demolition, child abduction, random bombardment, dispossession, torture, rape, murder, abuse, immobilization, deprivation, punishment, siege, occupation, had all never happened. And as though nothing has happened since, as though October 7th is the only day in history. This suspension in time, this being stuck, thus transacts two structures of denial simultaneously. In insistently and naggingly drawing attention to one day, it occludes all the days that came before, it blots them all out, it hides them from view, and it thus decontextualizes the events of that one day, making them impossible to historicize and therefore to understand. Not to support, but to understand. And at the same time, it hides from view all the days that have followed ever since, and hence it helps to justify the genocide that has been unfolding for every month, week, day, hour, minute, and second ever since. Stopping this clock on October 7th is what makes the other clock, the clock of genocide, run. This is the meaning of denial in an age of genocide. In this context, it's become almost impossible to talk. What I'm saying here is, in a sense, the ultimate dangerous idea. The people who wrap themselves up in this form of denial are so convinced of the narrative to which they cling, because it blots out and occludes any other reality, that any other form of argument, no matter what evidence it presents, itself becomes seen as a form of denial. I don't doubt for a moment that some people among you right now think I'm denying something that I'm not. This is because they're intent on looking over here, and I'm trying to break the spell by asking them not just to join me in looking over there, but to understand how here and there are related. One makes the other possible, until and unless the magic of denial is broken at last, and we start working together to help transform this system of violent occupation, apartheid, genocide, and death, in which we are all of us in the Western world complicit, into a democratic and secular state of equal citizens, a transformation that will not take place unless we help make it happen. Thank you.
This session was recorded live at Carriageworks Sydney in August 2024. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a not-for-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit ethics.org.au to find out more. Thank you.